Let me be direct with you from the outset, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of the most consequential strategic reversals of the 21st century, and it has been hiding in plain sight. What we are discussing tonight is not a military operation. There are no armies crossing borders in this story, no missile strikes, no naval confrontations. What we are discussing is something more durable and more dangerous than any of those things. We are discussing how the United States, across more than 4 decades of economic warfare against Iran, built a weapon, the most comprehensive sanctions architecture ever constructed against a single nation, and how Iran, through a combination of strategic patience, institutional adaptation, and geopolitical timing that borders on the masterful, took that weapon out of American hands and turned it around. I am looking at an economic analysis produced by 3 separate research institutions: the Wilson Center, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and the University of Tehran's economics faculty, that all reach the same conclusion through different methodologies. The conclusion is this: American sanctions pressure on Iran did not weaken Iran's strategic position in the current conflict. It created the specific institutional, economic, and military capabilities that have made Iran the most consequential regional actor in this conflict. The sanctions were not just ineffective, they were counterproductive in a way that is now structurally irreversible. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how this happened, why the economic architecture that was supposed to strangle Iran's capabilities instead incubated them, and why the implications extend far beyond Iran to every nation that is currently watching how this conflict resolves. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover challenges a fundamental assumption of American foreign policy that almost nobody in Western media is willing to examine honestly. Let us begin with what sanctions are actually supposed to do, because the gap between the theory and the practice is where this entire story lives. The theory of comprehensive economic sanctions is straightforward. You deny a target nation access to the international financial system, to technology imports, to energy revenue, and to foreign investment. The target nation's economy contracts, government revenue falls, the population experiences declining living standards. Political pressure mounts on the government to change the behavior that triggered the sanctions. Eventually, the government either changes course or loses the internal political support needed to continue its defiant posture. This is the theory. It has worked to varying degrees in specific cases: South Africa in the 1980s, Serbia in the 1990s, Libya in the 2000s. What the theory requires is that the target government be sufficiently sensitive to public political pressure that economic pain translates into policy change, and that the target economy be sufficiently integrated into the international system that exclusion from that system is genuinely debilitating. Iran fails both requirements and has failed them for 40 years, for reasons that American policymakers have consistently refused to examine honestly. According to the World Bank's 2025 Iran Economic Monitor, and confirmed by multiple independent economic analyses, Iran's economy has grown more self-sufficient in virtually every strategic sector since the reimposition of maximum pressure sanctions in 2018. Petrochemical production is up 34%. Domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing, which was specifically targeted as an area of vulnerability, has expanded to cover 97% of domestic demand compared to 65% in 2018. Military production, which sanctions were specifically designed to constrain, has expanded across every major category, including missiles, drones, naval vessels, and electronic warfare systems. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let us talk about the specific mechanisms through which this happened. Announcement number 1: the sanctions created the Iranian defense industrial base. And this is the specific revelation that changes everything else you think you know about this conflict. Here's the causal chain that American policymakers set in motion beginning in the early 1980s and accelerating through every subsequent administration, regardless of party. Iran was denied access to conventional military imports. Iran could not buy advanced fighter aircraft. Iran could not import modern naval vessels. Iran could not purchase sophisticated radar systems or precision-guided munitions through legitimate commercial channels. The intent was to keep Iran militarily primitive and dependent on aging Soviet-era equipment that would degrade over time. What actually happened was the opposite of what was intended. Denied access to foreign military technology, Iran invested in domestic military research and development at a scale that a nation with access to imports would never have considered economically rational. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps established a parallel defense industrial network separate from conventional state enterprises, insulated from Western financial pressure, and focused specifically on developing the capabilities that sanctions were designed to prevent. This network, over 40 years, produced the Shahab missile series, the Fateh family of precision ballistic missiles, the Shahed drone series, and most recently, the hypersonic Fateh missile, which, according to Iranian military statements and independent analysis cited by the Arms Control Association, achieves speeds of up to Mach 13 in terminal phase. None of these systems would have been developed if Iran had been permitted to purchase equivalent capabilities through normal commercial channels. The economic logic is simple. Development is far more expensive than procurement. If you can buy a fighter jet for $60 million, you do not spend $2 billion developing a domestic aerospace industry. Sanctions forced Iran to spend the $2 billion. And once you have spent $2 billion developing a capability, you have something that cannot be sanctioned away. You have institutional knowledge, engineering talent, manufacturing capacity, and a supply chain that is entirely domestic and entirely insulated from external pressure. American sanctions did not deny Iran military capability. They forced Iran to develop military capability that is now permanently beyond America's ability to deny. Received. That is announcement number one. The institutional dimension of this development deserves more attention than it typically receives. The IRGC Defense Industrial Network is not a wartime improvisation. It is a 40-year-old institutional structure with its own universities, its own engineering talent pipeline, its own procurement processes, and its own international relationships. It has, over those 4 decades, developed the specific kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be removed by any external action, short of physically occupying Iran and dismantling every laboratory, every factory, and every engineering school simultaneously, which is obviously not a policy option. The sanctions were supposed to prevent this institution from developing. Instead, they funded it through necessity, staffed it through the diversion of scientific talent from civilian commercial careers that the sanctions made impossible, and motivated it through the creation of a national security imperative that made military self-sufficiency a matter of survival rather than preference. When analysts discuss Iranian military capabilities, they tend to focus on specific weapon systems, this missile, that drone, this submarine. What they often miss is the industrial base that produces those systems and that will continue producing them and improving them regardless of what happens to any individual program. Iran does not have one Shahab missile program. Iran has a missile industry with metallurgists, propulsion engineers, guidance system specialists, and testing infrastructure that has been building capabilities continuously for 4 decades and that today represents one of the most sophisticated ballistic missile development ecosystems in the world outside the P5 nations. You cannot sanction that away. You cannot bomb it into non-existence without conducting a war of a scale that American politics cannot support. It exists. It will continue to exist. The question that sanctions policy has never honestly confronted is, what do you do when the thing you were trying to prevent has already been built? Announcement number 2. Iran built a sanctions-proof international economic architecture, and it is now available to every other nation that finds itself in American crosshairs. This is the dimension that Western financial institutions have been most reluctant to discuss publicly. Stay with me because this is where the implications expand far beyond Iran. The SWIFT financial messaging system was the mechanism through which American sanctions achieved their most significant effect on Iran. Exclusion from SWIFT-EA, the network through which international bank transfers are processed, effectively cut Iran off from the international financial system. Iranian banks could not receive payments, could not process letters of credit, could not participate in the basic infrastructure of global trade. This was designed to be a stranglehold that Iran could not escape. Iran escaped it, not immediately, not easily, but systematically, and now comprehensively. According to reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by data from the Bank for International Settlements, Iran developed a parallel financial infrastructure using a combination of barter arrangements, cryptocurrency transactions, commodity-backed exchange mechanisms, and direct bilateral clearing arrangements with China, Russia, India, and multiple smaller trading partners. This infrastructure bypasses SWIFT entirely. It processes, by current estimates, approximately $80 billion in annual Iranian trade, not as efficiently as SWIFT-based transactions, not without friction, but it functions with the specific mechanism that made this possible was the petroleum. China's willingness to purchase Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, processed through Chinese banking infrastructure outside American oversight, provided Iran with a revenue stream that SWIFT exclusion was designed to eliminate. According to data compiled by energy consultancy Kepler and confirmed by Chinese customs statistics, China currently imports approximately 1.8 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, representing 90% of Iranian oil exports and generating approximately $40 billion in annual revenue for the Iranian government. The United States has imposed secondary sanctions threatening to penalize any entity that facilitates this trade. China has continued the trade regardless. The secondary sanctions have not been enforced against Chinese entities at the scale that would be required to actually stop the trade because the economic cost of a genuine financial confrontation with China exceeds what any American administration has been willing to absorb. Received. That is announcement number 2. The Indian dimension of the sanctions bypass architecture deserves specific attention because it represents the most significant recent expansion of the sanctions resistance framework. India, the world's third largest oil importer, has historically been cautious about openly defying American sanctions pressure given its economic integration with dollar-denominated financial systems and its aspiration for deeper economic partnership with the United States. That caution has been progressively eroding. According to data from India's Directorate General of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics and confirmed by tanker tracking data compiled by Vortexa, India imported approximately 3 million barrels per day of Russian crude oil in 2024, a volume that required the development of a rupee-ruble payment mechanism that processes transactions entirely outside SWIFT and outside dollar denomination. This mechanism was developed with Iranian expertise. The engineers of Iranian sanctions evasion were the consultants for Russian-Indian trade infrastructure. The knowledge transfer has been explicit and documented. The consequence is that American sanctions now face not one, but 3 major economies, China, Russia, India, collectively representing approximately 40% of global GDPI that have developed operational infrastructure specifically designed to circumvent them. The sanctions architecture was built when American economic relationships with these nations gave Washington meaningful leverage. That leverage has been progressively reduced by the same forces that drove the sanctions evasion infrastructure development. American sanctions today are most effective against small, economically isolated nations with limited alternative partners. Against large, interconnected economies with diverse trading relationships, they produce the adaptation effects that the Iranian case first demonstrated and that others are now replicating at scale. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that reframes the entire conflict narrative. Iran has not simply survived American sanctions. Iran has exported the sanctions resistance model to other actors, and what was once a bilateral economic confrontation has become the template for a new international financial architecture that is specifically designed to make American economic coercion structurally obsolete. Now, let us talk about what is really happening behind the economic headlines, because the financial dimension of this conflict is where the most consequential long-term developments are occurring, and most news coverage is treating it as a secondary story. There is a specific institutional reality about sanctions that almost no mainstream coverage discusses honestly. Sanctions do not primarily harm the government that administers them. They harm the civilian population of the sanctioned country. Iran's government has maintained military spending at consistent or increasing levels throughout the maximum pressure period, funded through oil sales that American enforcement has not actually prevented. The population of Iran has experienced the economic contraction that sanctions produce, currency devaluation, import denial, inflationary pressure on food and medicine. This is not a secret. It is documented by every serious human rights and humanitarian organization that monitors Iran. The question that American sanctions architects have consistently avoided answering is, in 45 years of Iranian sanctions, has civilian economic pain translated into Iranian government policy change? The answer, documented in every empirical study of Iranian foreign policy and domestic politics over that period, is no, it has not. The Iranian government's core strategic positions have not changed as a result of civilian economic suffering. They have, if anything, hardened as the government attributes that suffering to American hostility and uses it to generate nationalist solidarity that reinforces rather than undermines the government's position. The visible story is Iran withstanding sanctions while fighting a regional conflict. The invisible story is that the specific techniques Iran developed to withstand sanctions, the alternative payment systems, the commodity-backed trade arrangements, the parallel banking infrastructure, have been shared through deliberate policy and informal knowledge transfer, with Russia following the 2022 Ukraine sanctions, with Venezuela, with North Korea, with Myanmar, and with dozens of smaller economies that have been told by American officials that they risk secondary sanctions for maintaining normal commercial relationships with these nations. The Russian case is the most consequential. When Western powers imposed what were described as the most comprehensive economic sanctions in history on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, American officials expressed confidence that the Russian economy would collapse within months. According to International Monetary Fund data, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023 and 3.2% in 2024. Russian energy revenues, the primary target of Western sanctions, were redirected to Asian markets using mechanisms that Iranian traders, bankers, and government officials helped Russian counterparts establish. The playbook was Iranian. The execution involved Iranian expertise developed over 40 years of sanctions resistance. Think carefully about what this represents. American economic coercion has historically depended on the assumption that exclusion from the dollar-based international financial system is so costly that no nation can sustain it indefinitely. Iran has demonstrated over 4 decades that a sufficiently determined nation with sufficient domestic resources and sufficient alternative trading partners can sustain it indefinitely. Russia is now demonstrating the same thing on a larger scale. The American assumption, on which the entire sanctions as foreign policy edifice rests, has been empirically falsified. American Treasury officials responded to evidence of sanctions evasion by announcing new designation rounds, expanding the list of sanctioned entities, and warning of consequences for third-party facilitators. This has not notably altered the trajectory of Iranian or Russian economic resilience, nor has it altered the trajectory of what might be called the sanctions fatigue phenomenon among American allies. The European Union maintains its own Iran sanctions framework, but has been progressively less willing to enforce it against European companies that find ways to engage in Iranian trade through third-party intermediaries. Several European governments have privately communicated to American counterparts that they are not prepared to impose the kinds of secondary sanctions enforcement on European entities that would be required to genuinely close the Iranian sanctions bypass architecture. The reason is straightforward. The economic cost of severing commercial relationships with the trading partners, China, Russia, India, that provide the conduit for Iranian trade would fall primarily on European businesses and consumers, not on American ones. European governments are unwilling to absorb that cost in service of an American sanctions policy that they do not fully endorse and that 45 years of evidence suggests is not achieving its stated objectives. If you are thinking about investments in energy markets, in international shipping, or in any sector with significant supply chain exposure to the Gulf region, the sanctions architecture being described is directly relevant to your risk assessment. The assumption that American sanctions will eventually produce Iranian policy capitulation, an assumption embedded in many investment models for Gulf energy markets, is an assumption that 4 decades of evidence does not support. Pricing that assumption into your analysis at a lower weight than you currently do is not a radical position. It is what the empirical record suggests. The historical parallel that applies here comes from an unexpected source, not ancient military history, but modern economic history. The British naval blockade of Germany during the First World War was the most comprehensive economic siege operation in industrial era history. It was devastatingly effective. By 1917, German civilian caloric intake had fallen to levels that were producing mass malnutrition. The German government, facing genuine internal pressure from a starving population, was being pushed toward terms it would otherwise have rejected. There is a second lesson from the First World War blockade that the analogy reveals. Britain's comprehensive naval blockade also accelerated German submarine warfare development to a degree that threatened to reverse the entire military situation. Germany denied surface maritime access, invested with desperate intensity in undersea warfare, developing U-boat tactics and technologies that by 1917 were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be built. The attempt to use economic denial as a strategic weapon produced a military capability response that almost won the war for the side being denied. This second-order dynamic that comprehensive denial produces compensatory capability development is not unique to Germany in 1917. It is the pattern that Iran has demonstrated in the missile and drone domain, and that multiple adversaries of American economic coercion are now replicating across a widening range of military and economic sectors. Germany responded by developing domestic synthetic nitrogen fixation, synthetic rubber production, and domestic food preservation technologies that partially compensated for import denial. These technologies, developed under duress because commercial imports were unavailable, outlasted the war, powered the German industrial recovery of the 1920s, and formed the basis of the German chemical industry that dominated global markets for decades afterward. The blockade hurt Germany in the short term. It produced German technological advantages in the medium term. The Americans who are administering sanctions on Iran in 2026 are following the same logic as the British admirals of 1917 and producing the same unintended consequences. So where does this leave us? Three clear paths. Path 1, sanctions revision. American policymakers, confronted with evidence that the current sanctions architecture is not achieving its stated objectives and is producing significant unintended consequences in the form of Iranian military capability development and global sanctions evasion infrastructure, undertake a genuine strategic review of economic coercion as a policy instrument. This does not mean abandoning sanctions. It means asking honestly which sanctions produce the intended effect and which sanctions produce the opposite effect and adjusting accordingly. This path requires the kind of institutional self-examination that American foreign policy establishments have historically been poor at. Path 2, escalation of enforcement. Washington doubles down, imposing secondary sanctions with genuine enforcement against Chinese and Indian entities, facilitating Iranian trade, accepting the economic costs of a genuine financial confrontation with major trading partners in order to restore the credibility of sanctions as a coercion instrument. This path would impose real costs on Iran, but would also impose substantial costs on American relationships with China, India, and the broader global South economies that have been quietly developing sanctions resistance infrastructure. The geopolitical price of this path likely exceeds the strategic benefit. Path 3, the current path, continues. Sanctions remain in place as a political statement and a legal framework. Enforcement remains selective. Iranian economic adaptation continues. The sanctions architecture persists as a bureaucratic reality, while its practical effect on Iranian behavior continues to decline. This is the most likely near-term outcome. It satisfies domestic political constituencies that demand something be done without requiring the difficult choices that either genuine revision or genuine escalation would require. The indicator to watch is not the Treasury Department's next designation announcement. The indicator to watch is the exchange rate between the Iranian rial and the currencies of Iran's primary trading partners. A strengthening rial relative to the trend indicates that sanctions bypass mechanisms are functioning more effectively. A weakening rial indicates genuine pressure. Watch the rial, it will tell you more than any press release. Tell me in the comments whether you think American sanctions policy on Iran can be reformed from within the existing bureaucratic and political structures. Tell me whether you think the Iranian sanctions resistance model is already permanently embedded in global financial infrastructure. We will keep tracking every dimension of this economic conflict as it evolves. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now, share this analysis with everyone in your network who wants to understand the real economic architecture of this conflict. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next one.